My great-grandmother embarrassed by nightmare stepmother in her will. My stepmother did not take this kindly. My great-grandmother and I were very close. As I grew up, her home was always a sanctuary away from my dad and stepmother's bullcrap. As a side note, I effing hate my stepmother with all my heart. She had made fun of my autism, made fun of mental health issues of basically any of our family members. When my younger sister came for help from her father, my stepmother literally assaulted her and told her to never show her face again. She loves to shove her political conspiracy theories down your throat, and once she effing ate my custom-made birthday cake the night before my birthday after coming home drunk from a night out. Enough about my stepmonster. As Foz is my great-grandmother, she was also always very kind to my mother, even after my mother remarried, and at one point called the police on my father when he tried to lay hands on my mother when he found out she was going to remarry. The last year of my great-grandmother's life, she seemed to just deflate. My great-grandfather, her husband, had been dead for almost 12 years at this point, and I knew she missed him terribly, but that last year she seemed to talk about him more and more, and she lost a lot of weight, but never her mental acuity. One day, out of the blue, she calls my grandmother, her daughter, and asks for a ride. She has to an appointment. My grandmother obliges, and great-grandmother gives her an address, to a hospice. Turns out she had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 6 months before, and decided it was her time, rather than fighting it. She didn't tell anyone because she didn't want us to try to talk her into chemo and such when she was nearly 90. She passed very quickly after she entered the hospice, and meeting up for the funeral was the first time I'd seen my stepmother in person since I graduated from high school. I avoided her, and spent most of the time talking to my grandparents and my aunt. Even my mother came to the funeral, and I could tell she was very distraught about my great-grandmother's death. It was a lovely service in her tiny Methodist church, and then she was buried next to my great-grandfather in the nearby cemetery. My grandmother asked everyone to stay in town while she handled the will, and then we'd separate everything out. I told her I couldn't afford to, but I wasn't working at the time and she offered to let me stay at her house. My great-grandmother's house was locked up like a vault. My grandmother, probably in a blessed moment of foresight, hired security to watch over the house and its possessions 24 hours a day, and wouldn't you know, every day they had to report a redhead in her mid-30s tried to go into the house and they had to turn her away. About 3 weeks later, my grandmother called everyone together at my great-grandmother's house to handle the will. Please friends, line the llamas up to the left, yourselves to the right, and snacks will be handed out in an orderly fashion. My grandmother decided to do a reading of the will. I am about 100% sure this was because her own llamas were nearly starving from 3 weeks of laying low, and they desperately needed to be fed. Attorneys don't normally do readings of the will like you see in movies, so my grandmother read it, but my great-grandmother's attorney was there, with a box, that was to hand out things from my great-grandmother's safety deposit box in the bank. The will was organized by generation. To my grandmother, the house and whatever remains of her possessions and money after everyone else listed has received theirs. To my great-uncle, my great-grandfather's personal effects, like his watches and cuff links. To my aunt, my great-grandmother's antique sewing machine that she'd inherited from her mother, and a lot of her vintage designer dresses. To my aunt's husband, my great-grandfather's classic car. To my uncle, their summer home by the lake. To my uncle's wife, my great-grandparents' books except the cookbooks, and the bookshelves to keep them in. To my dad, my great-grandfather's golf clubs, pipes, and camera equipment. To my father's wife, also known as my stepmother, $1 with a notation that she never forgave her for the way she treated her precious great-grandchildren, and that she will enjoy watching her burn in hell, even if it means great-grandmother is condemned to hell herself for such vindictive thoughts. I think my grandmother was fighting off a smirk the whole time she read that. It was taking all of my self-control to keep my butt effing silent. Thank God I had tissues so I could pretend I was crying into them while laughing silently. To my father's first wife, my mother, $250,000, plus whatever is needed to pay off her house and student loans. Y'all, my mother wasn't even at this meeting. My stepmother started screaming, insisting that someone had tampered with the will. She's not family. My grandmother looked at her with that 1,000-yard stare and said, neither are you. My dad is beet red, but my grandmother has always been able to at least keep him quiet. After a few minutes of yelling, my grandmother told her to sit down and shut up. They weren't done. To my great-uncle's son, my great-grandfather's boys' cabin, and all the contents. To my aunt's children, a trust fund to pay for college, each. To my uncle's stepson, who he always treated like his own son, a trust fund to pay for college. To my younger sister, a trust fund to pay for college. To my younger brother, $250,000, and an heirloom necklace to give to his wife if he ever marries. To my younger brother, my mom's child with my stepfather, a trust fund to pay for college. To me, $250,000, her jewelry box and its contents, her cookbooks and the contents of her kitchen, and a letter. To my brother and I's children, should we ever have any, a trust fund to pay for college. If we reach the age of 45 without children, the trust fund is to pay out our share of its remaining sum to us. Followed by a notation that if anyone contests the will they get nothing.